Hello, and welcome to Andrew Broussard Watercolors. Today, we're going to do a fast and loose watercolor landscape painting, a sketch of a master painting. Today, I'm looking at Thomas Girtin's Above Bolton. So, I found this originally in one of the British watercolor books that I have. It just kind of spans some time frames, and it has a section with Thomas Girtin in it. I Googled looking for the image so I could work from a digital copy while I'm in the art room and put a copy above this. And there seemed to be a few variations of it. There was even some titled The Stepping Stones Above Bolton, and then it led into different things in that area. So I guess maybe this was the area he lived in. I really don't know. I know that he lived a short life. I think he died around the age of 27. But that being said, definitely a master painter. Definitely absolutely fantastic. I think this is the second one we're looking at by him. I'll talk about my ideas with this one after I introduce the materials. I have a quarter sheet of Stonehenge Aqua that I saturated with water. It's 140 pound cold press, 100% cotton. So with this one, I like the trees. I really like that classic, traditional dotted tree landscape, and I haven't been able to get that mark correctly. And I figured, pull this one up and play around with that in that regard. The second thing, while I was getting the camera ready, looking at this, it's interesting how kind of tonally you have that dark mountain in the background. The trees in the midground are darker, but compared to the foreground, it was just interesting things happening tonally. You have the high horizon line, you have the dark sky, just a lot of interesting things to play with. So here I got some raw sienna, and I mixed a little bit of ultramarine into it. And I feel like this is the color that might be useful for these kind of rocky, sandy cliffs. I have to increase this. Mix. And we'll use this to map out and get an idea of where everything is. The water that is kind of bright white, I'm not sure if that was the white of the paper or gouache. So I'll probably experiment with gouache. I've been having a lot of fun with that. And I am not certain where the light is coming from for that water in and of itself. Let's mix some ultramarine and some burnt umber. It's just a little formula that I follow for stormy skies, and this formula I think came from James Fletcher Watson in one of his books, just kind of storms over a mountain. But I did read, and I quote another artist saying that the formulas aren't often helpful because you have different brands, you have different pigments, you have different water ratios, different mediums that you're painting on top of. I'm darkening it up some and splashing in some burnt sienna. I might try to make this study a one video study. They have been splitting into a part 1 and the part 2, where I have the wet and wet stage and then the dry brush stage. I know that I'm gonna have to dry brush, and that's where I'll kind of really experiment with the mark making for the trees. But this is generally how I go about mapping out a painting or a drawing or anything. Just kind of going around putting my marks in and I find it just is my way of getting things in proportion. It might be a holdover from art classes in college. It probably is. We had some different ways of going about getting things onto the paper. I never took a watercolor class. It surprised me in Carlson's Guide to Landscape Painting. I'm using the paper towel just to pull out to the white here. Even though I plan on using gouache there, I can still see how far we can keep this white going. It surprised me in Carlson's Guide that he said that a student should paint in oils, and that watercolor was a master's medium. So this is Carlson, the 1920s book. I want some more burnt umber, burnt sienna in there. But it kind of makes sense when you lay down oil paint. You can rework it, you can push it around, you can mix it around, etc. And you don't have the tonal shift that takes place in the moment, because whenever our watercolor dries, we have things lightening up. Whenever you're laying some paint down, it's easier to put some paint down over other paints and other pigments. Some different brushes kind of let it go down easier. So there are a few different things you can do that's easier with oil paints. Oil painting does suffer from the sinking in, where I think it's just the oils itself are sinking into the surface that you're painting, and it leaves a matte effect in some spots, and some areas might not and appear more glossy. So that's kind of one of the issues with the oils. I think the varnishing is what fixes that up. Anywho, whenever I thought about the comment, it had made sense. But I don't think you should be scared away from watercolor. I think a lot of people are originally. Looking at these reflections here, I wonder if they're kind of on the cooler side. Let's get a little bit more ultramarine blue in there. More raw sienna. Let's pull this out. We're gonna have so much fun farmland to play with back here, and to play with the trees. These cliff faces, that's interesting too, and I think valuable to try to paint, just because, you know, a lot of people are gonna have mountains in their scenery. If not, you're gonna have rolling hills. I mean, you might have flat land like I do, but we have our waterways and our coulees, and we have the banks and the edges right there. And I'm sure you would take the same exact approach to those banks and edges as you would to the side of these sloping mountains. I'm for a darker mix. This is with ultramarine and burnt umber. And of course, you're welcome to follow along with these. I do feel like these videos stumble along at times, mainly because I'm learning real time and exploring real time. I really didn't take much time looking at this one before I started the painting, mainly because it's 6:30 in the evening and still got 2 more weeks of work before summer break, and I like to go to bed by 9. I'm not an old fart, but I sound like an old fart, so we'll just say I'm an old fart. I think what's important, and this is just speculative, is that I'm trying to retain a lot of my original approach to watercolors while doing these experiments, so that I can adopt some ideas and feelings from these paintings and these experiments, and that this should add compositional value to my approach. It should add tonal value, etc. The wet and wet stage, I enjoy playing around in it. We could probably at this point stop the wet and wet stage, and we're probably, I can look in a second, but I'm going to guesstimate 12 minutes in. That's going to be my guesstimate, and then we'll look. These light washes in the water, grab a little quill brush just to kind of push a little bit around. Yep, we're exactly 12 minutes and 7 seconds. I'm going to pause this for a dry off, and then we'll start the next stage. All right, so just use the blow dryer. I love the wet and wet stage. I think that for me, it's just something that really helps create unity and a harmonious effect throughout the painting. You could spend a half hour in the wet and wet and get almost a finished painting. It depends on like the style that you enjoy. I'm mixing up some burnt sienna and ultramarine while I talk. Now, that being said, I wonder how much other people spend in the wet and wet. I know some people like Stephen Cronin, you know, a fast and loose watercolor painter, kind of carrying on the Ron Ranson tradition, will put in a great sky and ground relatively quickly and then do his dry off. And I've seen Alan Owen and David Usher. Percy Poo, that's the cat. Say hi, Percy Poo. It's not wet yet, so you can stand on it for a second and say hi to everybody. Now you have to get off. Oh, there we go. Where they've kind of partially wet the paper, where they'll pass quickly with a brush, and then from there paint over that. I've played around with that. It has really interesting effects, but I would leave a lot of areas kind of white and have a lot of white speckled areas showing through at the end. This is probably 2 or 3 years ago when I was experimenting with that. Excuse me, and I think it was a little too much. And what I mean by that, I have no idea. I'm just reflecting back on that and thinking of ideas. We carry over into more bluish mountain back here. Usually I'm mixing the light red oxide, but I haven't used any of that yet for this painting. And we can see if we could omit that. We have that bright upper portion right there. Moving over to raw sienna. If we could keep the palette minimal, that'd be good. I was reading something interesting in a Claude Lorraine book. We're just going to wash some raw sienna down and just play around, maybe lift some spots to lighten it back. And I'm going to blab a little bit about the Claude Lorraine book, a comment that I had seen. It was a Claude Lorraine exhibit, and I think the book was of everything that was in the exhibit. And there was somebody in the 1960s, Roth something, I can't pronounce it, has umlauts over it, who was, I believe, a Claude Lorraine expert and compiled a lot of information on him. And apparently during Claude Lorraine's time period, the 1600s, he was painting prolific, but there was also a lot of people mimicking his paintings, so essentially people copying him and selling it as if it was a Claude Lorraine painting. So there was a lot of discussion from the gentleman in the 1960s and reflections on stuff in the exhibit and in the book in reference to comments from the 1960s. How some of the paintings seemed an actual Claude Lorraine, a plausible potential fake, a fake, etc. And they actually showed some fakes with the original, and it looked very interesting. And it was also very interesting to know that they were copying and creating forgeries back then in the 1600s while the guy was still alive. Anywho, one of the things they were talking about, kind of a progressive timeline, where in landscape painting, in what they would attribute to his younger years and being a younger painter, there'd be more zigzags in a landscape painting. So this is kind of the culmination of the story, where the zigzags, etc., were used as techniques to help create the perspective and the landscape going back into it, that 3D effect. Where we, at this point, if you've watched this channel, if you've watched other landscape painters, you'll know that we'll work with warm and cool tones, we'll play around with atmospheric perspective, we have linear perspective, we have a whole bunch of different techniques to create recession within a landscape painting. And it's interesting that chronologically you can use potential techniques like that before other more sophisticated methods are created by the artist through his career for depth. So hopefully that makes sense, and I thought that was very interesting and profound. Also, whenever you look up these art pieces, some of them will say by appointment only, schedule an appointment to see it. And I think that a lot of these are just not on public display. I'm not saying it's the case with this one, but I've seen it with a lot. I'm thinking that obviously these trees are the darkest tonally. I am going to mix up a dark for them. let's go ultramarine and burnt umber. That's going to give us a gray. Let's see if I get a little lemon yellow in there. Get a little greenish. Now, my concern, and I think that starting with these first is the correct thing, and then we can create our lighter tonal varieties based off it. So the correct progression might be to map these out, and we can darken them as needed. I'm using the quill brush. This is just a it's like a $15 quill brush off of Blick. It's the Atelier. The other day I was playing around and I really never liked the stamping effect of a quill brush, and they always seem to make this semi half moon shape, and then it finally hit me that that's a great stamping effect for the tops of trees in the distance. And just turn sideways to get just a little illusion, wet and wet, of trunks. I know I have to play around with different ones because, like down here, we have the more dotted trees, and it just doesn't work for that. But for me, this is a little addition to go with. Before I experiment with different brushes, I'm going to lighten this mix up with just some water, and we'll get these larger groups in, the ones that are closer to us. These guys on the right read a little bit weird. At first it feels like a foreground tree coming up, but I think they're meant to be masses of trees coming down and then passing down the slope. I think that the quill brush, and you know, if you watch the channel, you know that I'm obviously a fan of the hake, and I use it in almost every painting. This is a good expressive brush, and really any brush works. You can find, you know, what works for you and what you like. I'm curious what type of brushes they had back then. I'm sure you could simply look up pictures of exhibits. This area is still wet from when we passed some raw sienna over it before, but it might actually be beneficial to help us put these fast and loose masses in. And I could do a dry off and play around in a moment. These darker portions, that gray, grab a little bit of Payne's gray. I just have a soupy mix on the palette right now. So I believe the direction of these strokes are important to help create that near vertical face inside of that mountain. Let's see. So we're going to play around here when I dry off. Play it along with the edge. Just kind of going in without really looking at the picture at this point. Just going in. A little bit of gouache, just to see. It's just a pigment I've been experimenting with. It's a mustard yellow. That's the description that Joe Menza and Matthew Clemens came up with, and they were really on point. I figured that might help a little bit, make things a little interesting. I don't think it works too well here, but it was worth trying. I had an oil painting professor in college, Chris Summerjeff. I always look him up once in a while just to see, like, you know, if he's like posted anything to his website or anything like that. And anywho, he would walk around, so we would have the oil painting class, and he would take the palette knife and he would just start like scraping and scratching into the painting and saying, you know, this needs to be fixed, this needs to be fixed. And, you know, we were devastated and aghast that that was happening. But that, I think, was really important to show that a lot of these things are just practice and studies, and not to baby your painting, to go in and just wipe and you know, experiment. If you don't experiment, if you are too timid with it, you're not going to learn. Let me pause for this dry off, and then we'll play around with the next step. All right, so at this point, to continue with the talking of experimentation, I grabbed a Chinese brush. So this type of brush is the stiffer haired one, and it's used for the bamboo, the orchids, side brush for mountains. It has a lot of uses. And when I had started watercoloring, prior to that I was doing the Chinese brush painting, and I was watching Henry Lee, who has a fantastic YouTube channel with countless videos and just so much to learn. That being said, he had a mark that was referred to in Chinese brush painting, I believe, as happy dots, where they would take the brush, and I think there were some specific brushes for it, and it was essentially a stabbing motion, a poking motion onto the paper itself. And this was used throughout the landscape for their illusion of trees. The reason, and when I say they're, just, you know, Chinese brush painting, that style. So I'm curious if that will work for me for the dotted landscape. And I cannot keep this to a point. Because with the quill brush, I obviously have the difficulty that I talked about, which worked well with creating that shape. I'm going over just side brushing with this darker mix, same pigments, and just showing like a little bit different ways you can kind of go in there. But with the quill, I just had difficulty with creating a pointed dot. And unfortunately, I feel like I'm having the same with this brush as well. And I think it's in poor taste of me to show different brushes throughout a painting, because I don't want you all to be like, oh, I have to go out and buy this brush, or oh, there's that type of brush, I'd experiment with that, blah blah blah. Because at the end of the day, the most important thing, I think, is putting just any brush to paper. So once again, summarize Carlson's guide. You can put your pigment down with your finger for all he cares. As long as you're doing it. I think I brought this line up a little too high in the perspective. That's fine. If this was a build up to like a master painting, see where you can do this and then see what mistakes you made, how you want to adjust things in future ones. I wonder if they have sketch paintings like this, where they then have marks and show how they adjusted for the final composition. Alright, let's see if we can get a little bit better recession here. So I'm not doing the stabbing motion that I referred to by Mr. Henry Lee. If I'm quoting him correctly, I think his teacher essentially wanted him to like be as if you were poking through the paper. And one thing that always threw me off about the Chinese brush painting, a lot of the books will show the brush being held up in this fashion, but that's just not something I was able to learn. Okay, so let's see if we can fix some stuff here. We have a little rapids, a little bit of rocks right there, a little bit of rocks coming along. And I think after this application here, I'll do a dry off and we will, I'm going too dark tonally compared to the picture here. Anyway, after this application here, we will then experiment with some gouache over it. I feel like I have not cracked the code to dotted landscapes still. And I hope in these videos, in these experiments, I hope you're enjoying them, and that whenever I say things like that, I hope they don't sound too self-defeated. Because I'm enjoying this, and I'm enjoying the process and the learning, and I think the feedback has been very positive, so I'm excited that you all like it. That being said, of course, please like, subscribe, follow. If you have any questions, comments, anything like that, let me know down below. And if you want to support this channel, I have a whole bunch of ways you can donate down below. That helps with materials, etc. Okay, so let's pause this. We'll do a dry off. All right, still a little cool, but I just want to jump into it. Putting out some white gouache. I'll probably wind up putting out a little bit more in a moment. I don't put it on the palette because of the chalkiness and it kind of contaminates everything with it, but I do have a tendency to inadvertently contaminate the palette as I mix some colors with it. So we're going to go straight from the tube first. Straight from the tube. Oh, yeah. So a little bit of water. You know, it's fresh. Play along the edge here. One thing I was talking to Joe Menza about was something he had mentioned in the past. And when I asked about it, he said the purpose, but then he didn't answer the next question. An artist had a container of water mixed with white gouache, I believe he was saying. And if you know who I'm talking about, let me know below so I can look it up. And he would use it for kind of washes to help recede things, kind of the watery mix. Which made sense. I wound up having that actually happen and being used in the experiment with Thomas Cole's The Oxbow, using a watered down gouache to recede some distant mountains due to a storm coming over it. Okay, so I definitely got the proportion off here. I'm not going to really struggle to try to correct any of that right at this point. I want to use some stronger from the tube to play around. I have a little bit of yellow ochre there, so I'm going to catch some of that just so it's not just pure white. Anyway, so the question that I then asked Joe, which I don't know if he had seen or not, but it was, does the container of water with a little bit of gouache mixed into it, does it mold? I had some gum arabic that I'd put in an eyedropper bottle, just transferred from one container to the next, and it had grown a little culture on top of it. And I think just gum arabic, I guess it could feed off of that potentially if it's in moisture form. So that was my concern. I'm mixing in some more raw sienna now, a little bit stronger. Been playing around with the body color, just the mixing of the gouache with pigment in these paintings, in these experiments. What might help is if I do an aggressive correction. I have these two lines pointing off to somewhere in the distance. Then bring that down. And then that will create the narrowing. So even though I proportionally made it too high, I'm trying to correct it in that fashion. I did say I'd probably put out more white gouache, and I am. We can use it to kind of just sketch in and correct and change some stuff. Like I said, this was a study, and I think these type of corrections are fine. And play around with them and have fun with the marks that you can make. I was also thinking, on the previous one, I wanted to experiment with the micron pens in them and allow mixed media to start taking place. But I think I'll stay reserved in that regard. Let's do a light wash over here, see if it helps recede and how that affects. Let me know what you think about that once it dries. feel at this point it's just very expressive mark making. In fact, I'm just going to grab some lamp black and just play around down here and up here and see how that goes. There's other stuff on the brush. Well, let's try this off and we'll take a look. All right, so I'm going to sign this and then say after, Thomas Girtin, etc. But while I do that, I want to point out a few things. I think that I did learn quite a bit from it. There's the obvious perspective issue that I messed up, mixing up that, but did do a little corrective measures there. So I'm very happy that mid-painting, corrections can be made and you can play around and have fun with that. Second, this one is a good example of the strongest tonal value being in the midground. And that should be something really fun to experiment with, because with just tonality, usually having the darkest values in the foreground and receding to the lightest value in the background is just the atmospheric perspective, just playing around and experimenting with the location of that within the picture plane is, I think, important. So two really important things so far. And I know afterwards, whenever I sit here or sit on the phone and look at the picture that I wind up taking of it as it uploads, I'm gonna find more things. Right here, the white gouache wash. I think if it was a little bit more controlled and didn't come as high, it might help the recession of the plane itself. And in the moment, I actually was curious about how high to raise that. It does add a kind of fogging effect, so that might be a good atmospheric effect as well. Let's see, what else? I'm kind of umming a lot, sorry about that. The vertical marks, or the near vertical marks, versus our horizontal strokes, using just our texture and brush stroke is just a great way to portray the general landscape and the movement that's taking place. So definitely exploit that. Definitely use that texture to your advantage. This one is called Above Bolton. I don't know the year, but I use it active like 1800s, like 1800. Let's see. Got very playful with the gouache. It's something to think about. I had mentioned how I was mixing some raw sienna into it, mainly because the pure white gouache as highlights is something I'm thinking I might move away from, where a highlight won't be pure white in nature. This might be just a tie over from Carlson's guide, but it's something to think about. Definitely in the water if it's directly reflecting the sky, but maybe not in other locations. And speaking of the sky, I lost the darker elements in it in the initial wash when we were playing around and creating the scene and just laying everything out. I neglected to really set the tone for the sky, pun intended. Same thing with water. I really like to use that water wet and wet stage for where the water is going to be at. I think I rushed my wet and wet stage, but there is a time constraint on it, especially video wise. But the mark making, I am enjoying the quill brush more and more. However, I am not quite getting the marks that I'm personally desiring. I do have the round, which I believe that they had and had access to. Not silver black velvet, but had the round brush as one of their styles. But just so far, not a fan of it. Maybe the next video we'll play around with that. So I hope you enjoyed. Please like, subscribe, follow, and you all take care and have a great day.